Okay, folks, I think we're ready to go. Rock and roll here. Sorry, we're just trying to get tech working so that people on Teams can see everything that's going on to make sure the interpreter is pinned, and this is all going to work. So I think we're there, and I'll probably hear from my Teams folk if it's not working. Welcome, everybody. My name is Ashok Mathur, facilitator for this course. I did have a nice set of 4 slides I was going to show you to rethink land acknowledgements, but I think what I'm going to do is just send it to you instead because it's too much hassle trying to get this thing up and work, so we're not going to do that. However, I will tell you what we're going to do. I was going to, of course, reference the land acknowledgement that we make here at OCAD to talk about the Anishinaabe, the Haudenosaunee, and also the Huron-Wendat and the Mississaugas of the Credit. And as you recall from last week, what I did was I showed you a map or several maps about how these communities worked and historically had moved through these territories. This time, what I was going to show you were the beautiful slides, which I'll send to you, which talk about urban Indigenous populations, both in terms of percentage and also in numbers across the country. And they're interesting slides, and it'd be worth seeing and taking a look at that at some point. So I'll send them out to your classes, so you've just got that, and you've got access to that. They're kind of interesting to show how Toronto is, the largest city and metropolitan center, barely registers in terms of numbers because places like Winnipeg and Calgary and Edmonton have a much larger Indigenous population, and in terms of Métis population too, which is very important and critical in the history of what we consider to be this nation and its nation formation. That's what I was going to. I will send it out to you, but today I'm very happy to introduce a wonderful set of folks working with us with the Creative Research Inclusive Practices Lab, all right, known as CRIP, as you can see up there. And we have 3 speakers that are going to be speaking with us. I'm not going to go into lengthy introductions for them. They can speak to this themselves because I really don't like reading out introductions for people. But I will say this, we'll be ending up with a speaker coming to us from the UK, from Matt, who will be in the UK, and he'll be up on screen. Before him will be Roman, who will be sitting right there, and he's going to be speaking second. And our first speaker is Pam, who's sitting right beside me and is just raring to go, and she's done some wonderful work. I'm not going to introduce her by what she has done. I'm going to introduce her as who she is to me, as VP Research. I've always been looking to see what are people doing, not just to fit into the systems, but to change the systems. Pam is someone who's come to mind as someone who refuses to look at the system and just say, that's good enough. It's always got to be improved. It's got to be changed. It's got to be better. And that's what I find is really delightful about her. It encourages someone like me. I was going to say forces, but that's too strong a word. It encourages someone like me to try to think differently too, to see what can happen in a space like this. Before I turn it over to her, just a couple of announcements to let people know. There are accessible washrooms as you go, for those who aren't from, okay, just straight out the doors and right on that back wall. So they are there for you, and if you need assistance, just raise your hand and someone can help you out with that. I'd also like to let all the speakers know, and of course any questions that come from the audience to self-introduce when you're speaking, so people will know who's speaking to that. And Pam has a request that all speakers and presenters use visual descriptions of slides and self, okay? In terms of the ASL interpretation that we have up online, what we've said to the community is that we're going to keep this up for 30 minutes. If there are people in the audience that require continued ASL for the rest of the presentation, please let us know, right? Just talk to one of us and put up your hand and say you would like to continue. If not, we're going to relieve the ASL interpreters so they can go off. But we did want to have that here so people know that it's available. And if we're going to be using it, it's going to be there for you. Okay. I think that's all the announcements that I have for now. And what we'll do is we'll go through the 3 speakers and we'll take a break into the Lambert Lounge, have coffee and tea and such, and then come back here for some questions. But at any time, if people need time to take a break, just go out through those doors. You can go in there and help yourself to something, come back, or take time away. that's all perfectly acceptable. It's a very informal space to come and go. With that, I'm going to turn it over to my friend, my colleague, and a delightful person, Pam Patterson.
School of Graduate Studies for inviting us here this evening and for the care and consideration that Ashok, Hannah Dixon, and others, such as the head curator of 113 Research and my sometimes TA, Lachlan Macquarie. I'm echoing here. Have taken to enable this to be an inclusive evening for many in our communities. So I'm a white, older woman with low vision and physical disabilities with a silver brown brush cut, cat's eye glasses, and an at times irreverent air. So Creative Research Inclusive Practices, or CRIP Lab, was birthed from the Disability Caucus, which I established and led for over a year with the assistance of Graham Reniers from OCAD. For its inaugural meeting, I invited another faculty member to co-lead the caucus with me, and disability engaged members joined from all OCAD faculties. Unfortunately, we were umbrellaed under a structured association with certain expectations, and where the requirements to inquire, accommodate, or care, or seek to understand systemic ableism, how it operates, and how it can be internalized was not fully understood. There were many misunderstandings. I was profoundly traumatized when I was suddenly asked to lead leadership. The caucus as an entity never met again, and I felt silenced and erased. I realized that we needed to have an independent research entity to address issues such as these, and that would be committed to exploring and embodying a deeper critical understanding of ableism and of how disability justice structures, practices, and care need to operate. So I reached out to Roman, a former caucus member, and to a colleague and friend, Matt Hawthorne, who you will also meet this evening at the University of Derby, and we began to meet. We met with others in the disability arts community, both inside and outside of OCAD, nationally and internationally, as the lab formed and self-defined. We've completed projects, advised clients, and consulted with other institutions, people, and places. Now, after almost a year, it's almost a year, Roman. It was February, of last year. We are working towards a formal launch, an exhibition, working sessions, and a reception on March 15th, so mark your calendar. It'll be here at 49 McCall Street at OCAD. And it's going to present creative and research practices by members from across Canada and the United Kingdom. So as CRIP Lab, we seek to advance equity, inclusion, and access by becoming a leader in critical multilateral research, art, and design through a global network of accessibility and inclusive focused practitioners, academics, and community members. We create knowledge and insight through participation and expression. So CRIP Lab aligns closely with OCAD University's academic and strategic plan as it seeks to animate a research hub for creative critical practices and knowledge creation for a better and more accessible future. Our priorities are to engage students, so people like Lachlan, who is part of our lab as well, and we have also undergraduate students that have joined us as well. So it's really a nice mix of folks. Take on multi-interdisciplinary art and design inclusive research, work through a community of care networks, questions around higher education and disabilities, and act as a parallel lab to OCAD's Inclusive Design Research Center and to design at the University of Derby. Our actions include maintaining discourse and discussion, facilitating exhibition and curation, and generating and supporting projects. So I have a number of goals here as well that that Roman and I felt we should share. So be patient and see if there's things that may link up with you and in terms certainly with your own research as well. So our goals are to play a leadership role in developing dialogues and programming around issues of accessibility and inclusion of relevance to Toronto, to national and international partners. To develop programs, systems, and networks that involve and converse critically with people of widely differing experiences, including students, faculty, staff, researchers, artists, designers, curators, and larger communities. To stimulate curricular and co-curricular learning and innovative research in art, design, and curatorial practice and pedagogy through the lens of accessibility and inclusion. To amplify the voices of disabled artists, designers, and researchers. To develop public and exhibited art, design, and media interventions and works. To create a critical and creative research and practice hub around issues of access, inclusion, justice, and participation within OCAD University and Toronto at large. To advance knowledge and practice of inclusive design methodologies and works of design and art done by students as well as faculty within OCAD. To facilitate creating policies and guidelines for the inception of accessible practices in early stages of design or planning, academic or otherwise. And to activate an ethical, caring, non-hierarchical community partnership model for research and creative co-practice. So that's the lab. So following this intro, as Ashok mentioned, there's going to be 3 presentations by each of us. They'll probably be around 20-25 minutes. And then I understand from Ashok that you wanted to go to break and then come back for questions. Okay, hopefully I'll still be awake by then. So that seems to be what's going on. All right, so I have a juicy and sexy presentation for you, which is highly theoretical. So it will contrast with, I'm sure, with Roman's as well. So I want to talk about CRIP desire. The desire to be joyfully, creatively, and fully engaged. The desire to be CRIP-defined productive. The desire to transform the conditions that created inaccessibility in the first place. The desire to resist, reimagine, and reorganize normative societal and institutional values, structures, and assumptions so that my embodied participation is not characterized as slow, aged, crazy, inept, parasitic, or deceitful. The desire for a non-normative discourse. Cherokee scholar Quoley Driscoll notes that in pre-contact Cherokee, there were many words for people with different kinds of bodies, illnesses, and impairments. None of these words were negative or viewed those who were sick or disabled as defectively bodied. The desire for liberatory or intimate access, an access not just managed for the sake of inclusion, but crafted in the service of love, justice, connection, and community. As Mia Mingus declares, we don't want to simply join the ranks of the privileged. We want to dismantle those ranks and the systems that maintain them. It shouldn't be that we have to hold our tongues or risk backlash or be met with empty silence just to be able to talk about our own realities and the realities of our communities. It's not enough to just make sure that we can get into the room or that the conversation is translated or that we can access the materials. It's not enough for us to simply get to share what's important to us, though I know that many times we don't even get to do that. If no one knows how to hold what we are sharing, if no one knows how to understand and fully engage with what we are sharing, this is part of the isolation we disabled creatives feel every day. Embodying disability justice means that access cannot be used as a way to simply slide disabled people into normative culture. Leah Lakshmi Pyapsna Samarasinhan articulates this when she says, "You want to know how you'll know if you're doing disability justice? You'll know you're doing it because people will show up late. Someone will vomit. Someone will have a panic attack. And nothing will happen on time because the ramp is broken on the supposedly accessible building." Roman's laughing. You know this. We won't meet our benchmarks on time or ever. And Ashok knows this because he dealt with it. We won't be grateful to be included. We will want to set the agenda. Our leadership looks may include long, sick, or crazy leaves, being nuts in public, or needing to empty an ostomy bag, or being on Vicodin at work. It's slow. It looks like what many mainstream abled people have been taught to think of as failure. Too often, care in organizational cultures becomes our individual responsibility. Leave work early, go home alone, go take a bath, go to the gym, eat some food, go to sleep. So we attempt to do all of that self-care and then return to these cultures where we continue to participate in reproducing the very systems we're trying to break. Pyapsna Samarasinha further notes, many abled activists will happily add ableism to the list of stuff they're against. None of them think they're ableist. They're just totally clueless about what disability is. They sit silently, believe that they'd rather die than be us, think of disabled, sick, or crazy people as flaky or inspirational, but also pathetic and gross. They don't know any disabled history and are still running the shit the exact same way that makes or forces most of us to stay home. We have histories and cultures and skills and visions, and if we're going to survive, our work needs to be cripped the fuck out. Our work needs to center disability where being sick, disabled, mad, neurodivergent, autistic, blind, and or deaf is at its core. So, how, I ask, can we rethink and potentially shift institutional expectations that speak to these desires and to the need for an intimate and liberatory access? Desire, access, and intimacy are complex realities for me to realize as a white, older, disabled visual and performance artist and academic. I perform myself in public space in different roles and ask for different perceptions of a CRIP self in these spaces. So historic attempts to perform CRIP desires include the problematic example of partially paralyzed Ellen Stoll, who was seductively featured in Playboy in 1985. On the slide is depicted the opening page of her Playboy spread. Her face, as blonde and glowing, is shown to the right, and to the left, text snappily narrates her day-to-day life. A more recent example addresses Want, a film by Laurie Erickson. On the slide, a film still portrays a moment as Laurie bends into a kiss, her hand gently cupping her partner's face. The early circumstances surrounding this film speak to the suppression of a disabled artist's self-created, directed, sexy film from certain public screenings due to its being either too sexually explicit or having disabled content. Laurie, as self-described polyqueer femme-gimp porn star academic, writes, "In this short film, I show moments of passionate and erotic entanglement found in genderqueer CRIP desire. In one film promotion I read, the writer notes, Erickson often uses her films as an excuse to pull out her sexiest possessions, such as her pink vegan bondage cuffs." So my third example is from the film Sins Invalid, which premiered in San Francisco in 2006. It and the other performances that followed celebrated the sexuality of disabled artists, queer, gender variant, white, and of color, through arts in performance. So here are Kara Page and Nomi Lam in performance. Kara, as extravagant Black woman with profound presence, reaches out to Nomi, a white, feathered, large-bodied woman enthroned on a nest of human limbs. The moment is affirming, bountiful, and erotic. Says director Patty Byrne, who also later co-founded the disability organization Sins Invalid, says, the performances make us visible, eroticize us, and represent the full spectrum of our humanity. It's a space where we control the terms of the debate around our sexuality. Like Erickson, Sins Invalid initiate discussions around the possibility for affirming disability, not just as desirable, but as truly sexy. So for this talk, I intend to position disability as desirable and truly sexy to ignite and inform. I'm going to speak to my work in and for CRIP Lab in research, for theory, in art, and for action. So a decade ago in publication, I celebrated transmodernism as a theory and a practice for promoting transborder thinking and dialogue among those traditionally on the periphery. Rosa Maria Rodriguez Magda in 2011 read transmodernism as offering a network in which marginalized realities can be activated as fluctuating, fluid, and interconnected, reflecting a vast array of possible desires and identities. Those of us who work and live with socially or medically defined, quote, disabilities, whether acknowledged or measurable, visible or invisible, outed or not, the promises of a cyborg-like zoomed existence have been tantalizing, especially for us during the more recent digitally supported pandemic years. We can also now extend our senses through technological gadgets, find ourselves fitted with prostheses, or challenge our brain function with neuroplastic exercises. But, as Vivian Sobczak questions, do we now retreat into the cyber body and digital space to overcome the limitations and material demands of a body with disabilities? Or do we explore new fantasies, vulnerabilities, and competencies of that body? It's useful to pause and delineate some distinctions here. For example, the terms impairment versus disability. Being paraplegic can be seen as an impairment. Using a wheelchair in a non-accessible world is a disability. Being blind can be understood as an impairment. Not seeing if there's only printed text available is a disability. What is significant here, though, is disability as constructed concept arises from a non-accessible, normatively defined society. And different individuals and different countries take up these distinctions differently. The term impairment is often used in Great Britain, but person with disability is generally used here in Canada. And these definitions can be challenged and can change. For example, the term transabled now appears in the lexicon of mental illness. Those named as transabled, a term sometimes used interchangeably with body integrity identity disorder, are identified as having a deep and obsessive need to have a physical impairment. They ache for the wheelchair, the brace, or the silence of deafness. There are those who argue that body integrity identity disorder or being transabled is a mental illness, but some do not. What might it mean, I ask, to reconfigure a world in which impairment becomes that which is desired, not shunned? It's not the nose job, the breast enlargement, the tummy tuck we're talking about here, seen as more socially acceptable desire, but the need to be significantly disabled. Here we're talking about those who wish to have an arm amputated or have nerves cut to a hearing ear. What would it mean to condone surgical alterations to accommodate these types of bodily preferences? Has not society approved gender reassignment? Must this choice then be necessarily viewed as some masochistic deviance? It's a provocative idea. But what can the transabled as theoretical model provide? Perhaps in the same way that transgendered theory spoke to the possibilities for gender diversity and its social and cultural performance, so too could transableism encourage a vast, exciting array of creative peoples, practices, and performances. So let's transition this theoretical consideration to the practical and political applications, particularly in relation to performative and visual practices, and in and for positioning disability arts and disability artistic practice. So Sean Lee, who's the programming director for Tangled Arts and Disability, notes that disability arts is a specific arts practice which engages disability artists in creating work that expresses their identity as disabled people. But disability arts also carries further meaning. As disability arts practitioners move our work forward individually and collectively, we're contributing to the expression of a distinct disability culture, with unique experiences, perspectives, and shared values. Historically, CRIP artists have been silenced, othered, and stripped of their agency, often having to create and shape culture under paternalistic paradigms that have defined their art as outsider art or as therapeutic. The implication has always been that art is good for disability. But disability arts, notes Lee, flips this and asks us to recognize that disability is good for art too. Disability is repositioned in disability arts as radical, political, desired, sexy, and valued. Sean Lee further articulates, art in the Western world has always recognized the aesthetic potential of disability and disabled bodies, or, quote, the broken body, as characterized by disability scholar Tobin Siebers. Siebers argues disability aesthetics is not simply a question of the representation of disability in art. Rather, disability aesthetics challenges these tropes by centering disability experience and ways of knowing as critical frameworks that treat disability as an aspect of human variability with intrinsic value. Siebers further writes, disability aesthetics broadens the inclusion of disability by affirming that disability may operate both as a critical framework for questioning art historical aesthetic presuppositions and as having value in its own right, contributing to further future conceptions of what art is and can be. Siebers' conception of disability aesthetics recognizes the integral place and fullness of disability within culture. It's a provocation raised to challenge narrow conventions of both aesthetic beauty and of the meaning of disability. So, of course, an iconic example of this provocation is found in asking the question as to whether the Venus de Milo, here as pictured, a white marble Greek sculptured torso muscled woman, armless, would still be aesthetically compelling if she still had both her arms. So I've explored disability desire, transabled theory, and disability aesthetics here and in my own art making and research practice, and through teaching and mentoring. The classroom, graduate student advising, 113 research projects gallery, and CRIP Lab have become valued sites that stimulate for me colleague and student engagement here at OCADU. I facilitated several projects, exhibitions, creative research, and events over the years. Significant support for these initiatives have come from university colleagues, students, faculty, and staff, and from various offices, the Faculty of Art, the Faculty and Curriculum Development Center, the Office of Research and Innovation, the Office of Diversity, Equity, and Sustainability Initiatives, and from the Art Gallery of Ontario. In fact, my colleague in Artifacts, Lena Rodby, shared an image with me today of Judith Snow. And Judith was a keynote speaker for a symposium that Lena and I organized in collaboration with the Art Gallery of Ontario around disability and access and inclusion. When was that, Lana? Was that 2013? So that's like 10 years ago. Yeah, really interesting. So thank you. And thank you for sending that today. And we've been very fortunate also in receiving other funding from arts councils and other universities. So I'm just going to talk briefly about a project that I did with students in the spring. This evolved out of 113 research, and this was in the spring of 2023, and it was a campus-wide exhibition called Après-Quoi. So Après-Quoi as festival concept emerged out of the shockwave that hit us with the COVID-19 pandemic. I'm sure we're still remembering that. I hear it resonating often in classrooms still. What could possibly come after that? Two considerations from this global event focused the work of the curatorial teams from my undergraduate museums, galleries, and alternates course, and that of the student artists who responded to our call. We also had advisors. Lachlan was one of the advisors for the project as well, and Nama Freeman, who, you know, for those of you in grad studies may know Nama, and of course Lachlan is still in grad studies now. The response. So the two considerations were, one was the need to investigate and understand new ways of being together, of accessing spaces in each other using technology, masking, and social distancing. The other was the pressing desire most felt to listen deeply to those of us who are socially, financially, politically, and physically marginalized. How could we act as allies with people from the IBPOC and LGBTQ2S+ communities, individuals living in poverty and isolation, others without housing or water, and those who deal daily with assaults on their very identities? Longing, compassion, and care energized this work in innovative directions, birthing exhibitions at 3 OCADU sites. So each site explored this festival concept using different lenses. So at 100 McCall in the lobby, the exhibit was called To Be With. Medicine Plus Cabinet was at 113 Research, and As Is was in the little gallery space at Odessi. So As Is at Odessi as exhibit challenged the notions of a product-based, model-oriented gallery space by asking for the radical acceptance of disability artists' unique and diverse processes as makers. The curatorial goal was to challenge audience expectations of what it means to be disabled, to be an artist, and to bring marginalized identities into a gallery space. In the curatorial statement, students noted, COVID-19 has been a shock and a challenge to all. But to disabled folks, the pandemic and its aftermath have activated waves of burnout, dysfunction, fatigue, chronic pain, and much, much more. Partnering with OCAD's Disability Community and Culture Group, this is a student group of, I think, predominantly undergraduates, yeah. The Odessi Gallery held a space which invited artists to come as they are. This intimate gallery offered a place of respite, encouraged audiences to let go of expectations, welcomed non-conforming bodies, and recognized CRIP lived experiences. Curators further noted, we want to honor disabled methods of working by being inclusive and by understanding how time constraints, the pandemic, and various other factors may have an impact on the intimate access needs of disabled members. Therefore, rather than continuing the harm of asking disabled bodies and minds to be restricted to the confines of traditional gallery standards, we're building a space that represents a continuum of multiple disabled bodies and minds. And actually, just as an afterthought, I should mention that from the work that we did during that exhibition, it created this ongoing kind of discussion with Kathy Capon and Amanda Hottram at Odessi. I don't know if either of them are here. Of course, I can't see anyway, but what since then is they are now working on a project to look at what inclusive curation will look like, which I think is really, really exciting. So I'm actually in the process of working with Lachlan on a seed grant to really explore what inclusive curation can look like and how we can work with the research from CRIP Lab next year at 113 Research and really begin to explore not only the projects themselves, but also how we can explore different ways of understanding CRIP aesthetics and CRIP accessibility within a curation process. So it's really, there's some really interesting stuff that's going on here at OCAD. So I want to share with you, almost in closing, is one work from the exhibit. It's called For the Cost of a Spoonie, and it's made by artist, exhibit curator, and member of both the Disability Community and Culture Group and CRIP Lab, and that is, of course, Ali Brown. Ali Brown, she, her, is a mixed media artist who investigates past personal archival material, home videos, childhood drawings, and family photos as a strategy for documenting present perceptions. So the work depicted here on the slide is a figure measuring 29 by 15 inches at further points, head to toe, pinky to pinky. It's made of burlap, embroidery floss, red yarn, Post-it notes, to-do lists, calendars, and used palette paper. For the Cost of a Spoonie comments on how a student with an invisible disability can be overwhelmed by a typical art education. Brown documents the month-long toll that keeping up with a standard workload puts on her body. The title of work references the spoon theory, which was conceived by Christine Miserandino in a 2002 essay, in which she attempted to describe some of the hidden impacts that lupus had on her life, and specifically on her energy levels. The basic premise is this. Every day, an individual who is ill or has a disability wakes up with a certain number of spoons that they can spend on the activities in their lives. Once a person's spoons are spent, they lack the capacity to do other activities. Productivity is impeded and self-care is unfulfilled. Ali Brown notes, this work illustrates how all my spoons are spent. The red yarn represents a daily inventory of where my pain or symptoms were located. The rhythmic motion of the needle puncturing the fabric figure became a cathartic process, where instead of my body imposing pain without my consent, I asserted control by inflicting pain upon it. I sewed the body by hand and stuffed it with daily planners, used palette paper, assignment sheets, and other detritus until it burst at the seams, its hands and fingers starting to fray and disintegrate. This unintentional breakdown caused me to reflect on and mourn for my pre-symptomatic body, when my hands were my hands, under my control, not in pain or making involuntary movements at unwelcome moments. So works such as these by disability artists often narrate stories of exile, erasure, and isolation. They creatively call us to critically investigate, what can a body do? But even this question, notes David Heinziger-Nixon, is incomplete. A better question, he states, in reflecting on the possibilities for disability studies as a field might be to ask, what can a body do to? What can a body do to institutional structures, policies, and definitions of productivity, to the very conditions that created inaccessibility in the first place? What can a body do to realize its desire for liberatory and intimate access, to press itself to, in the words of Katerina Kolarova, to imagine CRIP horizons, alternative possibilities in which disability and its interpretive frames, epistemologies, and ontologies can be rendered desirables, and the structures which surround it profoundly contested. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Pam. there for a moment. As Roman comes up here to set up, come on up here. I just want to remind people that you can take a break at any time. There is coffee made in the back room in the Lambert Lounge, so please help yourself to that. And feel free to come in and out. This, like I say, it's very informal setting. We're also going to try and address this. I know there was a little bit of an echo problem. We're going to try and address that.
Was it bad?
It wasn't so bad. It was just, but it was some of the people online were talking about it. So we'll try and work on that, and we'll try and work on the video side too, because I think we're just getting a part of Pam's face there. I also want to thank the interpreters for being on. I did say after the first half hour or so, people could that we would relieve the interpreters unless there was a requirement from the room here, and I haven't heard from anybody about that. So I think we're okay. Just want to make sure that's all right. I think we're looking good. Okay, then we'll thank.
You don't want people to disclose though. So, folks, if you are someone who would like to keep up other than live captioning and would like to keep up ASL, please. I'm not asking people to disclose, but if you could just speak to one of the helpers here tonight, like Lachlan.
So we'll just take a minute or two to set this up. And again, people take their time to move through and go on that. But I want to thank Pam for incredibly voluminous presentation. And it was so nice to hear you speak. So thank you again, Pam.
Oh my God, thanks, Julie. It wasn't too good.
Great, okay.
Yeah.
No.
I think it was this, right? Okay, we're just gonna do
Yeah, you
it.
can post.
We're just gonna do it.
There's no
Yeah.
problem.
And you want to make sure that we've got video.
That we are recording?
So that we're getting a Roman.
Yes, I will move my computer right here. Do you need the light?
Not necessarily.
Okay, I will turn it off.
Maybe. I'm gonna do that. Question for you. Drew something.
This anymore? Yeah. This, no, I know like on me. Right now, yes.
Okay, so people should be able to hear you on there.
Yep.
Okay.
And see me.
See what?
And see me.
Oh yeah, right. Okay, perfect. But that's not coming up on the screen. So, but it's coming up for, as long as it's coming up for people on there. It's good. Perfect. Thank you. Yeah, this is fine, right?
Okay, perfect.
Because Roman's here, right? Yeah. Okay. Thank you, folks, for your patience. I'm going to bring up now Roman Romanov, who also works with Pam at the CRIP Lab. I wish I could say the same volumes I could say for Pam. I don't know him as well as I know Pam, and so I'm going to let him introduce himself. But I know that he and Matt and others are instrumental in this lab, which is critical for what we're doing here at school. So over to you, Roman.
Thank you. Okay. Can everybody hear me well? Yes, they can. Okay. Is there a way to do this with it? I don't mind holding it in my hand right now.
If you want to hold
Yes. I think
If
you
you-
can take it.
feel comfortable.
Is this? Yeah, I think this is a little bit better.
Okay. All right, so thank you guys for sticking along. My name is Roman Romanov. I am the second branch of CRIP Lab with Pam and with Matt. I am sessional faculty here at OCAD, as well as an architect, an accessibility consultant, and a person with a disability, myself. I am a white cisgender man with blonde hair. I'm wearing a suit, blue shirt, and I am somewhat older as well. No, we had this discussion. So I'm really happy that sort of Pam brought this really interesting and delightful theoretical beginning to explain to you guys what CRIP Lab is. I think my angle is going to be a little bit different because I came into CRIP Lab as well as part of the Disability Caucus, but I entered it as a designer, as an architect. And I wanted to take the lab into directions that are a little bit more design and project based. So I'll be talking a little bit about what some of the aspirations for the lab are as well. So it's going to be maybe a little bit different, so don't be alarmed. But essentially what I'm really interested in is how do we construct research or creative research through design. So I'll start with what I do at OCAD, which is I teach accessibility and inclusion in architecture. So I teach undergraduate courses about the code here in Ontario. So a very different perspective, which is not really art, but we do design eventually through concepts of universal design and sort of more advanced concepts that go beyond code. Some of the student work that has come out of this effort is classrooms for children with visual impairments. For example, where we design a space for kindergarten students or school students or high school students that incorporate different techniques of design in the built environment that are based on tactile experiences, audio experiences, etc. And it's really quite, these are some of the products of what we are trying to learn as to how do we incorporate these kinds of different understandings of space and experiences of space. Also, when we look at things like hygiene rooms or change rooms, how do we perform in public with disabilities? How do we, as Pam said, this conversation about bodies and space, which is also very, yeah.
The people only is not seeing the PowerPoint.
They're not seeing the PowerPoint. They see it
Right
now?
now.
Oh, no.
Sorry.
That's okay. So just going through some of the work that I mentioned. So this is the classroom for the visually impaired students. So there's sort of different techniques that are implemented here, including different tactile instruments in the classroom to allow for the students to learn through different techniques, such as audiobooks and different tactile, such as Braille on the floor and different features on the walls. These sorts of techniques are really about offering a diversity of reaches. So we're looking a lot at anthropomorphic elements here, and then dry things like turning radiuses or radii, door widths, and corridor widths, heights of sinks, things like that. We also look at different elements in our built environment, which is sort of the nexus of what I think CRIP Lab has a lot of potential of doing, where we just analyze how inaccessible our built environment really is, especially the city of Toronto. This is some stairs as you enter OCAD University, and some of the tactile attention indicators that are, let's say, not ideal. It can be very problematic for people who are visually impaired. So we analyze these things, and then we do audits, and we offer different redesign solutions. This is another example of a parking lot in Liberty Village here in Toronto, where we look at things like the Accessibility for Ontarians Disability Act, and we look at different guidelines, and we criticize these different guidelines in the law to understand how can accessibility be implemented a little bit better or a lot better as we grow to be designers, architects, landscape architects, interior designers, urban designers, planners, etc. So some of the aspirational material that I would think that CRIP Lab can and I would like to advance in my role as leadership here in CRIP Lab is a little bit more on the design side of how we can really influence the public realm in the city of Toronto in terms of accessibility. So it all kind of starts with this understanding or sort of our modern idea of a city. So this is an image of one of Piranesi's drawings, how he imagined the ancient Roman Forum. So this is a drawing from the 18th century that talks about how there's really no interstitial space between buildings. There's nothing really defined. There were no streets, there were no pavements, there were no sidewalks, there were no stairs. Everything was just this big open space. And you would move between these buildings sort of freely. And that was the idea of a streetscape back then. And then as we reach what ironically some of you might consider the Enlightenment, right? How we become enlightened, right? And then we start designing these cities. So on the left, you see Pierre Pat. This is a very famous section. It's a project for an ideal street. So this is from 1769, and it starts looking at how can we improve our streetscapes, because this example is actually really unhealthy. So this example brought a lot of diseases into the cities, and it brought water pooling, and it brought a lot of problematic conditions that needed the introduction of certain infrastructure in our cities. So this is where the sewage system was sort of reinvented, because the Romans already had sewers, but this is sort of a contemporary rendition of it. And on the right, you see how that sort of translates into what would eventually become our modern day city, but this is part of redesigning of Paris. So this is a street in Paris. This is by Charles Marville, who's a photographer. I'm just going to move this away. If I can, I can't. It's gonna sit here on the corner, reminding us. So, you know, there was this attempt to cap the earth, to eliminate odors and health risks, water pooling, and even noise. But at the same time, you know, there was this emerging tendency that we need to build our cities to be beautiful and to have these axes. And there was really a lot of these optical aesthetics emerging that really came at the expense of access and the expense of other sensory experiences that people before that surprisingly were able to use to experience the city, like tactile, audio, etc. And then coming into the 20th century, we come at this idea with thinkers like Le Corbusier, who was, I think, well, one of the fathers of modernism, and his glorification of the white male and able-bodied male in their form, and what is an ideal man or an ideal human, and how we need to design our environments and buildings around sort of these ideals, and how it's all interconnected, and it sort of spurred this huge tradition that went onwards, as you can see on the right-hand side, with different thinkers. This is sort of early postmodernism, I would say, that imagined this all-able man climbing around this endless labyrinth of a city, being able to climb and jump and move around the city very freely, completely without any kinds of inhibitions or impairments. So we end up being in these spaces that need a lot of care. So so fast forward to our day, some of the initiatives that I think I want CRIP Lab to start engaging with, and is a collaborative process between different agencies in the city as well as students. So activating students who can be interested, that are interested in increased accessibility or increased access to the city, but as well do so through not just collaboration, but also minimal interventions that do not really spur code issues or anything that's super major, but can still make a big difference. So here you see a foundation that's called Stopgap Foundation that builds ramps and sort of retrofits ramps all around the city. It's a really wonderful kind of organization, and it's not the only one. There's more of these in Iceland. So Ramp Up Iceland is another one of these initiatives that, with very, very few resources, they change streetscapes on their own in a way that it's almost guerrilla-like. So here it's a little bit more, I would say, quote unquote, organized, but it's not just a wooden ramp that students here can build in the wood shop, but it's something that I would assume, or I don't need to assume, but it doesn't really require too many permits or too much red tape. Another example of an urban intervention that's on a small scale, but can still mean things to our idea of accessibility and how do we intervene with the public and allow the public to come through, is this piece that is done through collaboration back when I was at U of T, through a few professors at the Faculty of Architecture, Planning, and Design. And it was also a collaborative project with students where they used these foam tubes to create novel kinds of seating. And this was on King Street. This is on the King Street streetcar line. So this is part of the sort of side drop-off area, I guess, where they actually made these things in their studios, in their workshops at the Daniels School, and then they assembled it, and sort of these really micro interventions in the built environment. Another really interesting example is the Bentway here in Toronto. So the Bentway is an organization that activates spaces underneath the highway, the Gardner Expressway that goes kind of along the waterfront of Toronto. So these are some examples of projects that, again, were done with students to change these public spaces through quite minimal interventions, not requiring, coming in with developers and whatnot to actually make a hassle. So this is a relatively big project, to be honest, and there's a few of these. This is called Staging Grounds, and it was in a collaboration between the Bentway, and its purpose is to collect water from the highway and bring it down to these pots and sort of activate new kinds of irrigation and to utilize rainwater, but also activate the space. There was an accessibility consultant on this piece as well, who I know is very good. So these kinds of redefinitions of space with access in mind is something that has a lot of potential here in the city. These are other locations around the waterfront of Toronto that do also engage this space in different ways. But as this project, like I mentioned, did require a few sponsors, so there was a budget here. It was a little bit more complicated, but still, we're talking about very small scale things here. We're not building a building or something like that, even though small things like pavilions or these kinds of projects are, in my mind, very, very possible. So other opportunities of what we have in Toronto that I think that I'm very much confident that CRIP Lab can engage with is something like the Streetscape Improvement Program, which is a collaborative program between the City of Toronto and the building improvement office here, where there are different opportunities to fund projects that are interested in both supporting local businesses, but at the same time activating a space. And this can be benches, banner poles, gateways, hanging baskets, pedestrian lighting, planters, sidewalk treatments, all these kinds of small interventions that can mean a lot to people with disabilities. Some of the examples are from Agency. Agency is a firm. It's run by Tay Carpenter, who's really, I know her well. She's very talented architect. She works in New York, but she teaches in U of T and at Yale. So her firm really does a lot of these projects where they take existing infrastructure or existing things in our built environment, usually detritus, and they redefine it to create new forms of access. So they were Agency with Sheep were the two firms that did the underpass in the Bentway. So here you see these bollards, essentially, or barriers redefined as landscape interventions or sort of city beautification elements that can be translated into seating. They can be translated into urban libraries. They can be translated to many different things, playgrounds for the community, community gardening as well, anything that can activate the community. Again, the budgets here are quite low, so it's something that I see as a big possibility. Little model, which is really cute. This is another project that I really like. It's called the New Public Hydrant, and it creates access for water for people. This is in New York, but this is a really interesting precedent to kind of democratize resources in the built environment. So again, this is like a little bit guerrilla stealing water from the city, but at the same time, it's a really interesting project of how can we use existing infrastructure to redesign our cities and improve access. So this is kind of the diagrams of the retrofits of how, again, these are very small things. It's just tubes that you cut and you weld and you insert into different public spaces. And this project was featured on Design, which is a design magazine, and it's kind of a very interesting example of how a new public hydrant would let New Yorkers drink from city water mains. It's a really interesting example. Again, very small interventions, but with an interesting impact. Another example is Toronto's outdoor mural and street art program that allows organizations to apply to do mural art. And here comes to mind one of Pam's, Mallory Tolcher, who is a wonderful artist. So this is this happened in Lions Heritage Park. It's a community court makeover in rural Palmerston, Ontario. So it's facilitated by visual artist Mallory Tolcher and communications director Lindsay Clemens. So for the past year, so this was back in 2018, Tolcher and Clemens have worked with students with special needs at Norwell District Secondary School as a collective group. They have explored the history of the community and evaluated the current equity and inclusivity throughout the town. Tolcher decided to utilize the students' ability as Special Olympics provincial gold medalists, as well as their passion for physical activity and their love for the arts, and renovate the local basketball and hockey courts into large-scale works of art. Through a variety of lessons and activities provided by the two teachers, the students in the school community work transition program each produced their own design to be placed on the surfaces of the sports pad. So you can see this really interesting collaboration between the students. And again, this could be something that's designed by, with, for students with disabilities. This is a really interesting opportunity and precedent for a really powerful project. Now, for example, funding from the city of Toronto for a project like this is about $7,500. It's not for one project like this. So it's not something that is crazy hard to execute with even that amount of funds. Perfect. So we're almost coming to the end, but eventually what is the purpose of all this is to, I think this kind of ties in with what Pam was talking about, redefining disability as our desire and centralizing it to a place where there's so much possibility if we integrate disability and we understand that it's just an integral part of the human condition. And one of a very, very, very smart and respectful scholar, David Gisson, who's recently released this book, I recommend you all to browse through it. So he says that disability provides alternatives that re-engage, and pardon me for saying these terms, weakness, frailty, and incapacity as affirmative qualities of human beholders and those who create architecture. So for example, this is last example, but this is a really interesting one in Spain. So this is by West 8. It's a landscape architecture firm. It's called Salón de Pinos. It's in Madrid, de Pinos. And, we typically see these kinds of alleyways, these allées, as very straight trees, tall, able-bodied trees. And here they're reusing sort of trees that are not that. And those aspects of those trees were very much accentuated and celebrated in a way that they created these stanchions, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, to support the trees with the bent trunk or what would usually be deemed unsuitable for a built environment. But here we actually celebrated that, and it created this really beautiful quasi installation, quasi something else piece in the built environment, which is really quite amazing, I think. So rather than a technical problem to be solved, accessibility should be considered as an integral aspect of both cultural and architectural history, centralizing and validating the existence of impaired citizenry and the built or unbuilt environment that we are in. And that's kind of the end of my bit. So I hope this was inspiring. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Roman. I'm very glad that people are taking advantage of the Lambert Lounge and the coffee and all there, because instead of taking a formal break at this point, we are going to continue with Matt Hawthorne. Matt is coming to us from the UK, so bear with him. It's 1 a.m. there, right? So I thank you for staying with us that much. You're feeling tired now. I'm sure you can see how he's feeling. But please continue to go back and forth, take a break in there. And I think after Matt's presentation, much like we did last week, instead of doing a formal question and answer, I think what we'll do is adjourn to the lounge, and I'm hoping that Roman and Pam can join us there. And I'll probably take my phone in there and keep the camera on for those of you online. I do appreciate that it's difficult negotiating this online, and I know the audio and video has been a bit of a challenge. Anyways, we'll see how that will work out, so you'll be able to ask questions at that time. And of course, those of you online, please, you can drop lines into the chat, and we'll pull in on that. So we've got Matt up there. Let's see if we have audio, and we be good to go.
Can you hear me okay?
Just seeing it through your. Can we get try and sort that.
These computers for the speakers. She said we should unmute and test.
No, like his voice.
Okay.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Oh, your mic's off? Oh, you don't want the mic on, you're right.
Can you speak again, please, Matt?
Of course I can. Can you hear me?
Isn't working.
Maybe what you can do is use them. So it's terrible. Use the mic.
Okay.
Let's see how it works there. Use the speaker.
Okay, again.
Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Yes, I can hear you. Oh, here comes Hannah.
They're fine.
You know what? Maybe.
I've lost you now.
Lost me. Okay, again.
Yeah, back. You're back. Yeah, got you now.
So it worked when you were muted or whatever it was before.
Okay, again.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
This is fine. There's no echo.
Isn't
Thanks.
Okay.
Okay. Keep talking.
I'll keep talking. Yeah, I'm happy to keep talking. Can you hear that all right? I can do a testing 1, 2, 3 if you want. Yeah.
okay, keep going.
Are we good? Are we good? And now my head is just thinking about things to say. So I'll probably start saying very inappropriate things if you're not careful. So okay. Are we starting?
Yeah, you have.
So this is actually quite a weird thing for me because I'm actually looking at I mean, as a sort of a head coming in, but generally a fairly blank screen. So I hope you can all see me okay, and do tell me if you can't. But one of the things about Teams is it always looks different from the presenter view to the audience view. So my name is Matt Hawthorne. I am the head of design at the University of Derby. So Derby is it was interesting, Roman talking about the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, and Derby is the kind of one of the cradles of the Industrial Revolution, indeed the English Enlightenment, and yet no one's ever really heard of it. But if you see a map of England, or England particularly, and put a pin right in the middle, you're going to be pretty close to where Derby is. So I'm really, really happy to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation. What I'm going to do is I'm going to share a screen and just there we go. Let's just see that now. Hopefully that is, people can see this. I'm just going to make it bigger. I've got a red box around it, so do tell me if you can't see this here. So mine's going to be a little bit different to Pam and Roman's. Just by way of introduction to myself, this is really weird. I'm going to describe myself, but I actually can only see I see no images of anybody in this. So I'm I'm a middle-aged white cisgendered man, and I would describe myself as being balding, bespectacled, and bearded. And there's a lot of us around in design academia as well. So so the thing I wanted to talk about today, coming out of the sort of formation, the conversations of the CRIP Lab, is around sort of norms and transgressions, and particularly around sort of boundaries. And what I want to do is to do something, introduce myself briefly. I don't really want to talk a great deal about myself, but also introduce the work of an artist in the UK who's really important in terms of disability and sort of CRIP arts, and predates a lot of this work here. So and with whom I worked with quite a few years ago, and gives sort of maybe an idea about how I got into some of this stuff. So by way of introduction, I'm a performance artist by training. I moved into architecture and environment as a field. As an academic, I have generally worked in design areas as well. So my work and interests sort of cross almost all of these areas of practice. Let's just see if. Right. Now, I don't know if anyone has seen, this is the transcript. In fact, these are Pam's words appearing in the transcript of this this very seminar. And I just want to draw attention to the censorship that is put in place by Microsoft. And the 4 stars there is the word CRIP. Interestingly, the other word that was censored later on was erotic, which I thought was interesting. Other words seem to appear quite happily. And I'm really interested in this. I'm really interested in this question around what is normed and what is seen as being sort of outside of those norms. You know, what is it? What are these words? What are these phrasings that are unacceptable? And I think in some respects, because actually one of the ways we've been approaching this, this question about whether CRIP is an identity or not, and it clearly is an identity, of course, but of course it has this relationship to the material and the social, as indeed every identity does. So this replacement of CRIP with the 4 stars was just really interesting thing, and I kind of wanted to just use that as a spur just to kind of ask some questions about this area of practice. By way of sort of introducing me, this is a book that I produced as an exhibition and book that I produced it was quite a significant project. As you'll see from the date, it's not new, 23 years ago. And the reason for showing something that's completely out of date here is this is probably where it starts to talk about sort of a really key question that has always interested me. This is the cover of the book. It's relatively well known. It got around a bit. I haven't done much since that's been as well known, but it features the work of a group of artists in the UK around this time who I felt were asking really interesting questions about the relationship of art to society. The Degenerate Art book, it obviously cites the 1938, I think it was, Degenerate Art exhibition, which was curated by the National Socialist Art Historians Society in Munich, under the watchful gaze of Joseph Goebbels, and cites a whole range of practices that were deemed, you know, unacceptable, antithetical to the dominant political identity at that time, which was National Socialism. And, you know, I don't need to go into much detail about what National Socialism is and did, except to say at the time of writing, we were quite interested. We were in the middle of what was Blairite Britain, very postmodern, very what was called Cool Britannia, very relativistic. So this is a question around what's actually antithetical to this apparently inclusive culture, you know, that may not have been so inclusive as we think at the time. So and where I started to come at this question from around boundaries. You know, boundaries, what is inside and what is outside. And we talk about outsider artists or outsider practices. We have a notion of the institution of art and the avant-garde, which is really defined really beautifully in this relationship by Peter Berger, the German Marxist art historian in Theory of the Avant-Garde, where he talks about the relationship between those practices that are outside the institution of art and the way the institution of art adapts, changes to incorporate those things. So you can see it with the avant-garde practices of the early 20th century, many of which featured in the Degenerate Art exhibition. Also, featuring some what we would consider to be some quite ordinary landscape painting as well. I mean, things that just material was suddenly seen as being transgressive there as well. So the incorporation of the institution of art of the avant-garde and that constant adaptation of and incorporation of these different practices that are outside the institution, that are pretty radical, that are might be said extreme, become part of the institution. And we can see that again in the way that transgressive practices are adapted into norms, and the normalization of those things become normal, I suppose, in that regard. And then there's also this word here, the everyday. The everyday is really important in the way that, I think we think about our art practices versus the extra daily. And this is a performance term which really describes the kinds of, it's usually used as a way of talking about non-Western performance and the way the body becomes extra daily, extra to the everyday. But what I'm really interested in is this line here, and this has been a little bit of an obsession for me for quite a long time, about what sits on that line. What is this boundary between these different spaces? This seems to me to be the actual interesting question here, about particularly as we talk about inclusion, which of course this is which we'll go on a bit more about. How is inclusivity defined? How does somebody cross the line either way between, normal practice or transgressive practice? So for me, this asks a question here, like, who is included? Who actually decides who's included? Who is doing the including? Is sort of really sort of key questions for me. How is this defined sort of institutionally? Who's defining context? And context is very much a focus for me about what what a practice is, and where does it come from? How does it sit? How does it relate to the everyday society that's around it? And particularly around who's decontext. It's a very unwieldy phrase of talking about decontextualization. And this is after an essay and a particular thinker, Rustam Barucha, who comes from a theatre background, an Indian post-colonial theatre maker and critic and political commentator, and an essay that he wrote 1997. I was very lucky to hear it actually spoken for the first time when he did it in a performance conference called Eternal India and the YPO. And the YPO, I'm not going to tell the story here, but it's a great story about global capitalism and these Indian performance practices that come from very, very deep context. They're rooted in villages, they're rooted in poverty. And he describes this moment in which global capital stands off against the YPO is the Young Presidents Organization. So these are the global capitalists of the time, and he describes this event in Mumbai where these rural performers end up in a standoff between a traditional working class in this rural performance culture and the YPO, this sort of global capital. And this moment, and he actually leaves it at that tension between those three things. And it comes down to the question of, right, how do we think about these practices? What happens to these things when by a performance form that is rooted in these village practices, in families, in the everyday, gets extracted and put as a showcase for global capital? And I think it's a really interesting, it says a lot, I think, about the way that institutions operate, the way that as we're seeking inclusion, and that is a big part of the lab. We are seeking inclusion. We are seeking these different practices that come from radical difference, and the kind of things that both Roman and Pam have talked about already, and indeed the practices that you'll all know about or have been discovering and wanting to bring those inside, the institutions of academia, the institutions of art and culture. This question around who's defining that, what's lost in that process, what makes those things work. And just thinking back to Roman talking about, the first slide he showed of Piranesi and this Roman space, and that facilitated a lot of access, a lot of participation, a lot of disease as well, versus one that is, highly planned. There's a kind of another history around that, around revolution in Paris as well. The creation of these boulevards in Paris, also as a means to move the army around Paris very quickly to crush dissent. But I think that contrast is very interesting around, what is it about these institutions versus something that is, I won't say natural, but comes out of the everyday circumstances of people, of difference, and these spaces where difference collides. So for me, CRIP, the 4 stars of CRIP, is institutional critique. It's a way of looking at things. It's a way of asking questions of the world, and particularly questions of practice. And there's a number of things. So what I want to do is to just drill down a little bit into one particular artist who was featured in this book. And the artist is Juliet Robson. She's a disabled artist, someone I've known a very long time as well, and a wheelchair user. And in this work she did for the book and the exhibition, she created this work called Shopping. The actual body of work is called Norman, around obviously looking at norms. And what you can see in these pictures here, they're very grainy. I do apologize here, and I'll just try and describe them. These are black and white photographs of a young woman who goes shopping in a shopping mall. We call them shopping centres, but a shopping mall, without her wheelchair. So you can see her pulling herself. She has a spinal injury, so does not have the use of her legs. They behave in some, very, very different ways. She was, and so you see her dragging herself through the what's the Victoria Centre shopping centre. You see her in a cafe. She's sitting on the floor, drinking tea, which is on the chair, with people around her. And so this document of this journey of going through the city and navigating the city, and engaging in the very, very everyday things. These are spaces that most of sort of English society would inhabit at this time. They're ordinary in the extreme, I would say, and just this act of doing something without your equipment, that asks a whole set of questions about what is actually inclusive here. So it's a very transgressive act, in my view. And she writes really beautifully about it in the publication too. Just some more documents here. Again, they're very grainy. I'm not going to try to describe them all. It's a mass of photographs of Jules You can see one at the bottom where she's sort of lighting a cigarette. In these days, we could smoke in public buildings. You can't do that anymore. And just navigating different kinds of shops, and part of the text is also about the response. She goes to a shoe shop and is trying on different kinds of shoes. You can see you're just getting through the kinds of spaces and being in the spaces with other people, and just documenting some of those sort of reactions for the book as well. And this is the page in the book. The book has a very interesting design as well. So and just is talking about this experience in terms of its timing, people's reactions, the people who have just been very pleasant and helpful. What does it mean here to sort of transgress, I suppose? So Jules is a member of Active Ingredient, which is sort of a digital collective doing all kinds of work now, still based predominantly Nottingham and sort of globally, but her focus is very much on digital technology and sort of ecologies. So lots of connecting up. The most recent project was sort of connecting up with the Brazilian rainforest and to the UK and things like that as well. So it's continued the practice here around just thinking about the relationships of dialogues and particular kinds of challenges. I'm not describing her work very well, I'm afraid. And just because I'm sort of here, I thought I would just give a couple of examples of my work, which I think are actually far less interesting than Jules's. But around the similar time to this, I did a series of works, and my work has always been about environments and navigating environments. And this was a piece, Truances, where performatively I would sort of wrap my head in gaffer tape. You guys call it duct tape, but we call it gaffer. And go for a walk. And this is the image on the left is in Cologne in Germany. The image on the right is St. Petersburg in Russia. And in these journeys, I become very dependent on others. So, and it was very interesting seeing the different environments at stake here. In Germany, people very, very heavy. There was a voice in my ear almost all the time. If I was, this is the Stadtgarten in Cologne, where people would come up to me and just tell me in German and where I was going wrong. I'd often have people going nicked in my ear, going because I was about to walk down a slope, and people often would take my arm and just help me through things here. And I think it's around the different kinds of sensing and the different kinds of navigation. I think it's very safe to say Russia was a very different kind of experience, this was a very interesting navigation, but people did not help in Russia. I think it's this is sort of in the early days of Putin as well, and very, very different kind of environment. But essentially, it's about navigating, understanding the environment from a performative position here. So this gives you, I put this here just to give an idea of some of the work that I used to do as a performance artist. But this question of the environment and how to interact with the everyday was very, very informative for me. And then the last slide I'm going to show is this. This is actually the piece of work I'm working on currently. I just wanted to sort of give an idea of the transition into design. This is Pam and Roman will be quite keen to see this because I've been talking about it for forever, and it's been the world's longest project. This is a public artwork, but it's sort of design space for a what we call a special needs school in the UK. This is a school for children age sort of 3 through to 19 who have profound and multiple learning disabilities. And this is a memorial sculpture, but also a very active sort of play space as well, that is still in the process of being constructed, and it's been in the process of being constructed for about a year now. So and I just wanted to sort of put it in here, but just because I thought it'd be useful to just give an indication of just how my practice has sort of translated from being a certain kind of work 20 years ago to, and I still make that work as well, to this, which is a more of a consultation process. This is a participatory process. This is working with the children in the school as well, and sort of engaging in this slightly crazy design, which is a sort of sonic design. There are instruments inside it, and it's creating various kinds of light effects and sensory responses for a quite diverse community. And I think it's worth saying here, the other thing about the community aspects of being disabled is they also reveal the connection, and going back to the notion of context, the connection to others. So children with disabilities in the UK particularly have a very close connection with taxi drivers, because that's how you get to school. That's basically every morning, you know, possibly for 15 years, you might have the same taxi driver who turns up and takes you to your school. And so you generally only get into those schools if you've got, you know, parents who can argue, and, you know, often there are certain kinds of provisions that can only be achieved by taking your local government to court. So there's all kinds of things which, you know, bring a whole set of social networks here that sit around one child and one family. And so I think this is a work that is trying to reveal and celebrate some of those networks as well. So that's me. That's where I am at the moment. Hopefully gives an idea of where I'm coming from with the CRIP Lab. It's a great pleasure for me to be involved and working with Pam, Roman, and also all the other members of the lab as well. I hope that makes some sense. I'm just going to stop sharing my screen just so I can actually see, because actually in that presentation I had actually no idea if anyone's actually still in the room or anything like that as well. So so hopefully you know, that is I'll stop there because I tend to ramble on for what ages, and hopefully that was useful and interesting. And if I can see people, excellent.